Okay, quick disclaimer. This is more for me than anything else, so skip ahead to the timestamp on screen to start the video proper if you don't care. So, when I plan these videos out, I usually do so about a month in advance. That gives me time to research, to write a script, to record footage, and to spend about 2 or 3 weeks editing the footage, give or take. I say that because at the time I'm writing the script, Noah Caldwell-Gervais just put out a really great video on Max Payne. Now, I won't lie that Noah's a real hero of mine, but I felt a need to make clear that I'm not making this essay to try and cash in on his stuff. For context, the thesis for this idea, and the video that you're now watching, were planned back in May. I get this probably doesn't need saying, but it will really bug me if I don't. If it's any consolation, the point that I'm trying to make here is a radical departure from his analysis. Anyway, here's the video essay.
They were all dead. The final gunshot was an exclamation mark to everything that had led to this point. I released my finger from the trigger, and then it was over.
Back in 2001, a lot of what made Max Payne unique came down to how it handled its bleak tone. At the time, few games were willing to tackle such grim subject matter, especially this brazenly. Even the nihilistic and viscerally unpleasant Manhunt wouldn't be released until 2003, so Max Payne was really in a league all its own, save for a small collection of horror games. I mean, this game opens with Max's wife and daughter being brutally murdered in a way that, even to this day, is pretty wrenching. And that's to say nothing of the game's dream sequences, many of which are still talked about in the gaming community on the same level as titles like Silent Hill. Between the conspiracies Payne finds himself in and the game's morose tone, there's no doubt that Max Payne wears its bleak outlook on its sleeve. So, naturally, today I'm going to argue that Max Payne is a satire, because of course I am. Broadly speaking, there's 3 categories we can look at to break Max Payne down as a work of satire. We can look at the game strictly through its story, we can look at the game through its systems and design, and we can look at the game through its relationship with the player on a non-mechanical level. To keep things easy to follow, let's start with Max Payne as a commentary on noir literature, specifically neo-noir literature, and then let's tackle some of the crazier concepts. I'm gonna indiscriminately spoil almost the entire game in this review, so if you're itching to play Max Payne, consider this your one and only warning. Spoilers ahead. As name might imply, neo-noir fiction is really just a specific outcropping of noir fiction. You've still got your standard literary cliches, the ones we all know and love: the grizzled detective, the gang boss with a heart of gold, the femme fatale, the sleazy crime lord, and so on down the line. Max Payne seems to have a laundry list of noir tropes it's trying to fulfill, and it dutifully creates a world that ticks off every last box right down to Max's hard-boiled internal monologues.
Lupino's tenement buildings were a seedy hangout for all kinds of sleaze. The how and why of it was a mystery to me, but they knew I was a cop. They knew I was coming, and they were going to get real trigger-happy about it.
The result is a game that feels almost like a caricature of classic noir cinema. There's a little bit of a tonal disjunction between the horror of the opening sequence and the cartoonishness of the faux Italian thugs walking the streets, but for the most part this operates somewhat cohesively. We'll come back to that later, don't worry. Besides, this only really describes the game's first half. The further you dig into Max Payne, the more obvious it becomes that the game itself is only partly a classic noir. From about the halfway point on, once the conspiracies and evil corporations and brain-bending fourth wall breaks come into play, it becomes abundantly clear that we're running with a different genre altogether. Max Payne seems to be more of a neo-noir than a classical noir. Neo-noir can be a little tricky to pin down as a genre, since there's not a lot of consensus as to what differentiates it from classic noir. To quote Robert Arnett's essay on 1980s neo-noir, neo-noir has become so amorphous as a genre movement any film featuring a detective or crime qualifies. The similarities are obvious, both genres are pessimistic, paranoid, and hard-boiled. Still, I've noticed a few trends among neo-noir works that seem to set them apart, including the narrative prominence of contemporary technology, a contemporary or near-future setting, and stylistic tendencies distinct from classical noir. There are other aspects as well which bear notice, many of which tie directly into the history of film noir. In his essay, The Darker Shade, Jason Holt writes, "There are a number of obvious differences between classic noir and neo-noir. The sex is more explicit, the violence more graphic, more extreme, and the forces at work behind both are of a decidedly darker hue. A neo-noir film need be much more realistic generally, but it can also end more realistically. Under the auspices of the rating system, neo-noirs exploit the much more realistic possibility that the guilty fail to get their comeuppance. Holt's point raises an interesting question. See, the language of Max Payne is wholly noir, through to the voiceover and the comically mean streets of the game's symbolically apocalyptic take on New York City. However, the violence and attempts at realism in the game, even if more tame by contemporary standards, place the game firmly in the neo-noir camp. However, the game's climax is decidedly neat and tidy to find the realistic conclusions that Holt emphasizes. Discussions about defining neo-noir as a genre aside, it's a curious point. There's a real tension in Max Payne between its dramatic inclinations and the inescapable camp of its writing. It's angsty, but in the unique vein of early 2000s angst, like a World of Darkness campaign, complete with seedy nightclubs and evil conspiracies. But the curious thing is that Max Payne still works as a game, even if its tone is all over the place. In fact, it almost seems to work better the closer the player gets to thinking about the game as a game. So before we really start picking apart Max Payne philosophically, let's take a look at how the mechanics of play inform our reading. Part of what makes the game work as well as it does, and prevents it from falling into complete tonal dissonance, is the moment-to-moment gameplay. And it's here that we get our third intertext, the filmography of John Woo. The game is less than subtle about this intertext.
It's me! Open up! Let me in, quick!
Not so fast. The password. John Woo.
Come on. Okay, John Woo.
But the actual delivery of it ties the game's disparate tones together. In an article published for Wired, Kevin Burke describes John Woo's style as an auteur through the lens of his film Hard Boiled. Gunfights as choreographed dances, violence as lyricized motion, action as art. Director John Woo elevates film genre to a level that transcends notions of big explosions and feeble plot development. His intelligent noir-like filmmaking relies on the cinematic movement of bodies, machines, and, oh yes, bullets. What really sets Hard Boiled apart is not the story, but how it plays on screen. When the bullets and bodies start to fly, the plot, characters, and dialogue cease to have any importance. It's 99% pure visual overload cinema, main lines straight to your eyeballs. Max Payne similarly uses style as substance in its design. Like Woo's filmography, the game juggles multiple tones throughout, settling somewhere between pulpy action and gritty noir. The intertext simply calls attention to this. Plus, the influence of Woo's work translates on a mechanical level too. Due to the sheer difficulty of the game, Max Payne uses bullet time, a mechanic which slows time for the player, allowing for more accurate aim and the ability to dodge some gunfire. It also allows for absolutely spectacular displays of on-screen violence, and is one of the few tools in the player's tool belt to keep Max from dying in an equally spectacular way. See, the game is really punishing, and the slow motion mechanic isn't just a means of infusing the game with style and tonally tying it together. It literally is the only thing making the game beatable. Max Payne is extraordinarily difficult, even with the slow motion, and the game is punishing as all get out. I don't know, maybe I'm just bad at games. A lot of that comes down to level design as well. While there's plenty of encounters in Max Payne that give you time to prepare and consider your directions of approach, the game also loves to throw ambushes at the player, often in situations they could never prepare for. That, combined with some openly unfair enemy placement, make the game a real challenge, albeit a fun one. F5 and F9 quickly become your friends here. What's interesting about this is that the experience of playing the game becomes something that takes the player out of said experience. You, as the player, are never fully engaged in the world because you're too busy considering the difficulty of play. Here, the level design takes the player out of the experience rather than fully immersing the player in the shoes of Max. So, what we're left with is a game that presents us with tones that are themselves disjointed but find some unity in gameplay that takes us out of the text itself. We are encouraged mechanically to look at Max Payne not as an immersive experience but as a work of fiction. For that matter, you can get that much by looking at other games that came out around the same time as Max Payne. It was released after the rise of the immersive sim, a la Thief or Deus Ex or System Shock 2, or even more immersive shooters like Half-Life. The text the game presents us with, on the other hand, is radically different, choosing to highlight just how unrealistic the experience is when contrasted with the narrative it presents. When combined with how Max Payne treats the fourth wall, I think it tells us everything we need to know about the experience. Okay, I know, I've been dancing around this point a whole lot, but it's because it's, for my money, the most fascinating part of examining Max Payne. About 2/3 of the way through the game, Max is drugged with Valkyrie and hallucinates a hellish version of his home. However, unlike previous versions of this dream in which you relive those dark moments at the start of the game, this game features 2 cutscenes back to back which manage to completely recontextualize the game's dissonance. In the interests of clarity, I'll show them here.
There was something disturbingly familiar about the letter before me. The handwriting was all pretty curves.
You're in a graphic novel.
The truth split my skull open, a glaring green light washing the lies away. All of my past was just fragmented still shots, words hanging in the air like balloons. I was in a graphic novel. Funny as hell. It was the most horrible thing I could think of. There was something disturbingly familiar about the letter before me. The handwriting was all pretty curves.
You're in a computer game, Max.
The truth was a burning green crack through my brain, weapon statistics hanging in the air, glimpsed out of the corner of my eye, endless repetition of the act of shooting, time slowing down to show off my moves, the paranoid feel of someone controlling my every step. I was in a computer game. Funny as hell, it was the most horrible thing I could think of.
These 2 scenes strip away any of the pretenses about Max Payne, revealing it as what it is, part motion comic, part video game. All the monologues and noir pretense at this moment are sacrificed in a moment of relative clarity for Max. In turn, the game's function as a metatext becomes all the more evident. The game actively takes us out of the experience of play to examine what the title means in context. A lot of critics seem to misinterpret this. One such critic, Alex Kazdan of All Games, somewhat harshly wrote, "Unlike Half-Life, where the action is integrated perfectly with its simplistic yet appropriate story, Max Payne frequently yanks you out of the game and forces you to look at a badly drawn, in-game graphic novel and listen to mediocre dialogue." It's a harsh indictment, but it's only half true. Kazdan is completely right that the game routinely takes you out of the experience, but it's not because Max Payne is a mediocre noir story. It's that the game itself is actively pointing out, regularly, that it cannot be the noir story it wants to be, based on the available trends in games. Instead, Max Payne presents us with a conflict that escalates past the point of reason, straight into the territory of 1980s action flicks. The game literally ends with Max in a gunfight with an evil CEO drug dealer in a helicopter, on top of a skyscraper, and the biggest blizzard in New York City's history. Yet, in spite of that, we never lose the morose tone. And Max himself often looks back on how ridiculous the whole situation is. The death of Max's wife is serious, but gunning down hundreds of mooks across New York City? Not so much. It's noir cliché trying to fit into video game cliché, and even with the tonal unity of John Woo, it's an awkward fit. In these moments, what Max Payne seems to suggest is that as a medium, video games were too entrenched in the familiar clichés to act as more complex narratives. It's one thing to tell a tragic story of loss and redemption, but doing so while mired in conspiracies and the occult and mini-bosses and enemies upon enemies upon enemies is a whole different matter. When Max Payne strips back the curtain, the seriousness of the narrative slips away. The game seems to be an indictment of the medium, stating that serious stories cannot carry weight, while video games as a medium are so entrenched in juvenile silliness. All the grit in the world can't compensate for gameplay that doesn't match the seriousness of the story presented. I know it's a bit of a downer note, but I think it's best that we leave the argument here, at least for now. Having said that, I want to go ahead and plant some seeds for the next Let's Talk, since we're not exactly done with this subject. In many ways, Max Payne throws down a gauntlet for us. If games have to grow up to tell more complex, serious stories, then how can they change? In the next Let's Talk, we're going to take a look at one very specific subset of games that seeks to address this issue, in a rather unconventional way. So join me next time as we take a look at walking simulators and ask ourselves, what does Virginia demonstrate about games?